Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. Consumers, enterprise, a variety of industries are moving to 5G. Communication service providers have to deliver an extraordinary experience. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, we're going to investigate the impact that 5G is having on consumers and industry, and particularly the fact that CSPs definitely need to leverage this with their clients. Joining us for insight into the way forward and what's next is Bill Stanley. He is going to help us see how enterprises can slice a piece of the network pie to build out those next generation services. Paul Norkus will help us understand the big picture. Well, Jay Thattel is here to discuss how to leverage Industry 4.0. And Ed Elkin will help us understand how network function virtualization helps make all of this possible. Gentlemen, thank you for being here to offer your insight today.
Good to be here.
Paul, let's start with you and explain Future X in that it's end-to-end 5G architecture. What does that mean ultimately? And what are these primary E2E domains?
Sure. So our end-to-end domain approach that we're talking about today actually came out of our research arm of Bell Labs and is built on what we call our Future X architecture, which is the defining architecture that Nokia takes to our communication service providers and how you deploy these communication systems, both mobile as well as fixed. And basically, as operators were going through their virtuous cycle of improvement, they wanted a clear path to be able to bring these new 5G services to market. It isn't about a rip and replace. It's about providing an evolution strategy so they can easily get to these, bringing in these new technologies. And so the idea is you want to have call it a Lego blocks or a jigsaw puzzle technique of bringing all these different pieces together. And that's really where these end-to-end domains come from. And they're divided into 5 different areas. There's the actual network itself, the kind of like the lower layer that's providing all the communication infrastructure. There is the cloud domain, the end-to-end cloud, which is a fundamental change as we're bringing into these 5G networks, where we're distributing functions among the network to where they need to be the best. But then as you create services, you have network slices that run across all the way from the devices, through the network, through the core, even to the applications in public and private clouds running across it, as well as a key thing, which is making sure all of this is secure. Now, especially then the 5th one that we have is as you get into the industrial space, having automation techniques to be able to quickly deploy and make these new services available for the enterprises so they can do all these cool and differentiating things that 5G is bringing.
So, Paul, what are some of the architectural issues that CSPs face?
When service providers are looking at their network, they're not looking at them as silos anymore. They're looking for these systems that can integrate and couple together. For example, if you just look at the end-to-end 5G network itself, whether you're talking about the massive scale access, the smart network fabric, and the cloud native core, and how these really provide the differentiating services. Starting with the access, the new frequency options that are out there, the new spectrum assets, getting into the millimeter wave, the amount of traffic that's expected to become that's going to be delivered over those networks. You need to be able to expand these networks into these new frequency spectrums that are available out there. But all of this traffic that's being generated, you need to then think of your transport. How are you going to support this? You mentioned earlier about how operators are seeing like a 1 to 100 increase in the signaling. The throughput's going to be the same way. The content that people are consuming, not only does your radio network need to support that, but also your transport networks need to be able to support that.
And Jay, I can imagine for CSPs, the real value creation is by targeting those enterprise customers.
Yes. Definitely. CSPs, the traditional market is consumers, but if you look at how 5G is going to pan out, the ARPU for the consumers are either flatlining or declining. So they won't get the ROI. 5G is a huge investment for CSPs. So with enterprises, they can now tap into mission critical applications with low latency, high bandwidth, ultra reliability, all these characteristics of 5G that makes CSPs now monetize new use cases with enterprises. We did a recent survey or research with some of these leading markets, asking enterprises what is their appeal on 5G, right? So the top 3 segments that came in was like manufacturing, retail, and surprisingly e-health. And manufacturing, we know, like we have been using automation quite a bit. And if you also look at like the number of industrial sites that needs to be connected, it's 50 million compared to the 7 million telco sites that are already here. So it's double the potential that CSPs have to generate some additional revenue on 5G. We have been doing several proof of concepts with many of these key players to automate their industry processes, robotics, assembly line. With regard to another use case that is very relevant to them is the video surveillance and analytics. We thought like this is really high in the agenda for manufacturing and some of the other enterprises as well for safety and security purposes, not just like monitoring how their production line is working, but this is to keep everybody safe, looking at the level of poisonous gases that they use in manufacturing, looking at the temperature. So for that, they are using video analytics and sensors to work in tandem to bring in those 5G efficiencies into them. E-health was a little bit interesting. Like one of the leading provider of healthcare who has got like 30 to 40 hospitals, there one of the key use case was like, how do I deliver medicine to within the campus without using human, right? So robots delivering medicine. So it was very interesting. This is really kind of what is used in manufacturing segment as well. So you can see some of the cross-pollination over there.
Usually when e-health comes up, we talk about robotic surgeries and things like that, but you don't have to go to that level. You can get right down to some of the basic structures of any healthcare provider.
Exactly. This is what you can do right now. And when the standards and the slicing and everything comes into place, then you can address the more important, they talk about remote surgery and all those aspects. That is going to come in. Another area where we have seen a lot of interest is the port authorities, right? We are seeing like a lot of ports using 5G networks.
Hamburg?
Yeah, and there are a few other recent ones that has come up. But what they're trying to do is like tracking the containers. Again, looking at the hundreds of sensors that are part of that, understanding where the container is, monitoring it with drones and other video surveillance aspects, and making sure it reaches the correct destination. So these are some of the industries where we are seeing like a lot of pickup on 5G that is happening already. But then you go into automobile industry. There is still a lot of stuff happening around that. One of our customers whom we are working with is tracking the raw materials that are going into the manufacturing facility of the automobile. And then they are looking at how it is distributed, the finished product is distributed to the end customer. And then they are also monitoring how, during the operations, how you can update the software, looking into other 5G or car V2X use cases that we talk about, monitoring all those aspects. So if you look from that end-to-end point of view, you see several of these industries picking up in pockets in some places.
I think one of the valuable lessons in that is that you can look at some high-level services that 5G can help build out.
Yeah.
But there are so many areas below just the top level that still would take advantage of a 5G deployment.
Yes, and that's where it is still uncharted territories for many of the enterprises, right? They are slowly exploring and trying to automate and use the use cases that they're already familiar with. But there is still a lot more that can be done with 5G.
And Ed, cloud plays a very big role in all of this, but there's more to it than just hooking up a cloud machine to the 5G network.
Right, exactly. What the service providers need to do is re-architect as cloud native, but implement that not only in the network, but across their operations and business too, so they could take advantage of all that 5G can do.
And so with more of the network processes taking place in the cloud, I can imagine the security risks increase. How do we address that?
Right, a few ways. So looking at, say, the 5G core, that's built around what's called a service-based architecture with pretty strong encryption and authentication that takes place between those communications. Furthermore, as you go out to the edge of the network, we have security out to the devices, where in the past, the identifiers were passed over the air. But now that's actually protected, so it's less likely that somebody's phone could get hijacked. And finally, there's a principle of how the network is designed and built in its products, where Nokia provides a design for security principle and process, so that we look across all of our products and operations that's built into it.
And with that in mind, you're building in these security features at every level of the network. And this is a new approach to this to ensure that even if someone gets past the first wall, you've got many more walls to go beyond that.
Right. It's certainly important to have defense in depth. For example, a way that hackers typically attack a network is first they get entry into the network, and then they lurk there, they explore, they look around, they learn their way around the operation systems or the network. This is what's called an advanced persistent threat. So the key to this is detecting those people in there early enough. So to do that, you need security, orchestration, automation, analytics, where you're looking and detecting those people and minimizing how much time they're in your network or in your systems where they develop a more powerful attack. Find them early and get them out.
So Paul, as CSPs have the ability to build out these new features and new capabilities for their clients, ultimately this is about value creation.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. We talk a lot about the value of the architecture itself. But really value creation is about doing the massive productivity increases or getting the new service offerings to really enhance the human experience. And I think that's one of the key things is everything we do here is about enhancing the human experience. When you're looking at people, you either want to make their lives more efficient or increase their productivity in some way. And the networks that we're building are these end-to-end networks need to also be in line with that to be able to create this value for the end users. And that's one of the things as we're looking at these end-to-end systems that we can never take the human equation out of it. Because ultimately, even if you're talking to, say, an Internet of Thing device, it's got to have some benefit for the human experience in creating value for what they want to see come out of these systems.
Yeah, we were talking with Marcus Weldon about that not too long ago,
exactly.
about the importance of that experiential environment. In the enterprise world, the corporate world recognizes that consumers today want an experience, and it's got to be a unique experience. So this new technology gives them the ability to provide their customers with what their customers need.
Yeah, exactly. And basically everything we do is about enabling those experiences for those people. Like I said, even in an enterprise where you're doing some kind of industrial automation, the thing that it's creating or the thing that it's developing in the end should have some benefit to the human experience around it as well. Even to the point of just having VR gaming or creating a really incredible event experience. All this technology has no value unless there is some kind of enhancement or improving the productivity of people.
And you're nodding your head because you completely agree as the man responsible for keeping an eye on the network slicing component.
Yeah. Where do the slices fit in, right? So great discussion about the complexity of the network at the bottom and all of the new capabilities that we're all familiar with. And discussion about how we've got to tap into enterprise markets and find new revenue sources. Slices sit in between. Think of that connection. We say connecting the network to the business. This is the way that we take all of that interesting capability in the network, but simplify it, abstract from it, and expose it northbound so that enterprises and businesses can make use of those interesting capabilities, but in ways that matter to them. Business intent driven is a word that we like to use. So slicing is the way to, based on standards and templates, organize all of those capabilities inside the network and drive automation by creating programmability. Through that automation, we're able to expose the services northbound. Enterprise partners can join in on the revenue train, but operators can control their cost of operations as well and share in the profitability.
You mentioned the automation component to this, and as Ed had pointed out, the complexity associated with this behind the scenes. There's a tremendous complexity associated with slicing as well, such that you're not going to have an individual sitting in front of a computer screen pushing buttons. This has to be machine learning.
Yeah, it has to be ML, AI, all of those. But let's just talk about the network itself. When we speak 5G era, we speak of virtualized networks. And some of the industry analysts have projected, for example, network actions in a virtualized network can increase 100-fold. So if we're going to have that amount of complexity in underlying network, yet we want to simplify our operations and expose it northbound for enterprises to work with, we've got to rely on automation. The good news about a virtualized network is it's all software programmable. Programmability is a good thing. Programmability leads to automation. But we've got to put those automation steps in place, and as an industry, we've got to begin to allow ourselves to release that automation. Initially, we see a lot of shepherded, human-in-the-loop types of automation. Make sure things work correctly, make sure that we have controls over them, but eventually, over time, releasing many of those automations so that more and more we can step the humans out of the process. We call human-on-the-loop supervision type of a process, and then eventually full automation.
What are some of those things that we need to do, that we need to hand over to the machine?
Well, hand over to the machine, we've got orchestration at the very beginning. And orchestration is the process of threading an initial order through the entire operating system and putting it into the network so that the service becomes active and is available. And historically, we might have done that with manual steps, but there are too many iterations that need to be done, and there's too much coordination that needs to happen between the domains that Paul spoke of, and we've got to have machines involved to control that iteration. It's the only way to drive scale and accuracy.
So wasn't it Appledore research that said for every one action that happens in 4G, there'll be 100 in 5G? So that integration of automation is pretty critical, and that's where the value of end-to-end 5G would come in, is that integration.
Well, the integration among all the operating processes specifically. So if you've got that much activity going on inside this virtual network, you've got to rely on automation to get control of it, to manage it at scale without turning your operations cost, your OpEx, upside down. With a network that's changing that much and changing that often, we can't rely on the manual processes that we've used for years. We've got to release and allow automation in order to achieve cost efficiencies so that we not only see CSPs joining in a piece of the revenue of the 5G, but also do it profitably.
So Bill, your clients must be relieved. They don't have to rip everything out and start all over.
No, in fact, instead of ripping out, the idea is leveraging what they've already got and then using that as a launching pad toward the 5G rollouts. So we've got one customer right now who's leveraging their existing 4G access technology, putting in some new 5G radio access technology, and enabling subscribers coming in on either of those services to connect to and then through all of the layers of the rest of the network end to end to reach enterprise applications on the far end. To do this, they're designing slices that have got to traverse the radio access, the transport domain, the core, and then reach the end serving applications. That's end-to-end slicing right there.
So what you're telling me as well is that slicing is a technology that's coming, but it's not going to be a flip the switch day one type of technology.
Yeah, well, and there are different definitions of slicing. So in the purest sense, true 5G standalone slicing has one meaning. But slicing that is possible today, for example, we have a very good demonstration and example we have with a couple of customers announced this with us, where they're actually blending 4G serving areas with 5G serving areas through our radio access technology and grooming those users onto a slice-based backhaul service to, let's say, enterprise applications that are being hosted in the cloud. And that's a walk before you run. That's let's start doing some slice-type behaviors today to the extent the technology is available before we get to the true full 5G SA.
Jay, tell me about a different type of automation, that industrial automation, Industry 4.0. Where are CSPs seeing the most interest in that?
I think from an enterprise point of view, we talked about automation quite a bit already. Like with AI and analytics, they can tap into, for example, on a factory setup, you can have a flexible and a wireless assembly line or a production line so that they can cater to the ever-changing demands from their customers and without taking a huge hit on the cost. Then if you look into automation in the aspect of this low latency, high bandwidth use cases where video analytics is used to look into the anomalies of the production line. Again, this is all from a manufacturing setup. These are some of the examples where automation makes a huge difference for the enterprises, and the CSPs can provide that support.
You mentioned the wireless side of that equation, and that Industry 4.0 will be wiring up all those robots with 5G systems. Why? Well, isn't Wi-Fi good enough?
Wi-Fi is still a hotspot technology, right? If you're looking for a small area or a constrained location, it is still good. And many of the enterprises, the smaller ones, will definitely go for Wi-Fi. But if you look at like a bigger or a medium type enterprise, looking into macro sites, then Wi-Fi is not good enough. If you take the example of a utility company, they wouldn't want to share on a consumer level spectrum to provide their services. They would want more security, more reliability, low latency, all these aspects being in. So Wi-Fi is still good, but then on a macro level, 5G is the best.
Yeah, I think a key thing when you look at Wi-Fi is being an access mechanism. And from an operator's perspective, it's my opinion that it's what I call the interference you know versus the interference you don't know. And when you get into Wi-Fi, literally the place that we're sitting at right now, if you pull up our phone right now, you're going to see 30 access points.
Yep.
And how do you control that when you're in an enterprise environment is you can't. And that's one of the benefits of, say, licensed or lightly licensed spectrum that operators can take advantage of. So when you're looking at Wi-Fi as an opportunity, it's a really great thing, I think, for, say, enhanced mobile broadband techniques. But when you're talking about industrial applications and things that require high degrees of complex automation environments, this is really where I think 5G is going to be able to shine, providing true benefits in these kind of places.
And Ed, Jade touched on something very interesting as well, and the importance of cloud comes into this, that as all of these pieces of equipment are going to be talking to each other, they also need to talk to a central brain, and that brain can't be located 1,000 miles away.
Right. So a key part of going to cloud native in your network and operations is instead of only being in a central cloud, you can put critical workloads out closer to the enterprise. A couple of examples of why that matters. Think of scene analytics. You need to be processing a lot of video, but you don't want that latency, that whole duration of going back to the central brain and back again. With a cloud native system, you could put those smaller workloads at the edge of the network on a smaller set of servers. You could do similarly there with massively scaling up IoT or providing enterprise slicing. That becomes a much more nimbler network.
So how does a CSP ultimately become a cloud provider as well?
What they need to do is first, re-architect the cloud native across the network, business, and operations. Secondly, they need to implement a distributed cloud. So instead of only that central brain, use regional for some workloads and edge, especially for the latency or mission critical workloads. And besides all of those that the service provider owns themselves, they need to look up at the public cloud, such as AWS or Azure and such, and look how to use those public clouds as a way to scale out peak capacity or put service in an area where they don't actually have a private cloud.
So then it would be important to know the difference as to when you want a distributed cloud versus an edge cloud.
Exactly. So when do you need to put that workload out at the edge of the network for that mission critical or for that low latency versus in a central cloud, you could get into resource pooling and higher degrees of efficiency.
Ed, you've worked on some large scale deployments. What have you learned?
Two examples. So the first, one of our customers, Rakuten in Japan. They've announced when they launched their service in April, they're going to be pricing that at half the price of their competitors.
Half the price.
Half the price. And what are they noted for? Rakuten's noted for using the latest in cloud technology and using advanced automation. Second example, this is an operator who's in the midst of creating their plans to go into 5G. They're doing all the usual bids and analysis and all of this. Where are they going to put their core? They're going to put their 5G core in the public cloud. And what that's going to get them is the advantage in time and cost.
How does that become an advantage?
They can act faster with the time advantage. So let's say capacity ramps up faster than they expected. Well, with the kind of limitless supply of the public cloud, they can ramp up their capacity as well. Or if they bring in new innovation or new applications, they put it there. On the cost side of the equation, they don't need to pre-build out their own private data centers. They don't need to get all of that groundwork established and wait for that demand to follow the capacity. As the demand comes up, use the public cloud.
This sounds like a disruptive use of this technology.
Very disruptive. New entrant looking at doing 5G in a different way.
Let's talk a little bit about Industry 4.0 and how vendors can work with carriers specifically to create this real value proposition.
So CSPs, they have got several ways in approaching the enterprises, right? They do have the challenges on how they were dealing with enterprise as well, but if you're looking from a private wireless point of view, which a lot of enterprises are going for, telco is not their core business. And this is where they would want the CSPs to help them to guide and plan the 5G network for them. And if you look at the smaller and medium-sized enterprises, they would want them to not just provide the network, but also manage them, right? Sometimes we talk about slicing as a service, they would want to have certain part of the CSP network to use that. Then there is wider implications, like if you look at the global enterprises, if they have a global footprint, they would want the integration between their regional private wireless network to the CSP wide area network.
So if my automated car drives from Canada into the United States, you want to make sure it keeps working.
Exactly. So they just need to have that seamless handover. And this is where CSPs can provide that service, where enterprises cannot. So these are some of the ways that they can help.
So it's critical that CSPs develop relationships with vendors and build these partnerships.
Definitely, definitely. And I think like that's where the ecosystem comes into play. And many of the markets, many of these use cases are not taking up purely because they don't have the right ecosystem in place. Once the standards are there and then they have the right partner, then you can see these enterprise use cases kicking off quite quickly.
Paul, what though of the vertical silos that we often see in pretty much any corporate culture, and telecommunications is among them as well, how do we break down those barriers to ensure that you can build those relationships in an industry that may not be accustomed to having to do that?
I think the key thing is going to be able to provide services to these kinds of enterprises and businesses, but you need to do it in a rapid fashion because there's going to be new innovative services that are continuous going to be coming out quite often. This is where the orchestration and the automation piece, when you talk about, say, creating a network slice, needs to happen very, very quickly. So to be able to engage with, say, operator and say, I don't know, fleet management trucking company where you want to, use their front dash cameras to monitor the flow of traffic for insurance purposes you're going to keep on a centralized service, versus 2, providing localized monitoring of trucks moving through, say, a depot area. How do you quickly create those kind of unique applications and services? And that's where all these different end-to-end components come together to being able to do it. So when you look at 5G and the challenges that operators see, probably the biggest ones I think is really being the ability to quickly create these new and differentiating services and getting them deployed into the network so they can monetize them.
Yeah, and there we come back to the slices again, because getting it deployed into the network is network plumbing, and that's one side of what the slice does. But as Paul says, we've got to expose these capabilities to industry verticals who themselves don't need to become network engineers. We can't make them have to become network engineers. They have business purposes. So all of those dimensions of a fleet management company, for example, that's the language they live. And the capabilities they need from the network need to be exposed and made available to them in a nimble fashion, but in business terminology. And then we need a layer, the orchestration layer, that orchestrates the slice and serves as translator. It translates those business intents into network-facing intents and constantly plays in the middle in between the two.
And as far as the constant interplay behind the scenes within 5G, let's talk about the virtualization component to this, because CSPs will have the ability to give their clients, their new customers, ones they never had before, the ability to essentially build out their own software systems and technologies on a 5G network, but you have to keep that contained and secure.
So this is where, with the 5G architecture, the service-based architecture with the authentication and encryption there within the core, within the control plane, plays a critical piece. From there, you can extend APIs out to your partners, out to new sources of innovation. But critical for this, for the security control, is providing security in depth, security across that continuum. Part of that's in the standards that 5G is defined. So the phone numbers are kept more private. There's the authentication and encryption taking place. But you also need to go out to the edge of the network again, to those, say, IoT devices, where that partner is developing a new application. And actually on that IoT device, which is really outside the scope of the 5G standards, you still need to secure that, say with an endpoint security product, and apply a design for security across your entire service so that what your customer actually gets from you is secure, is resistant to attack.
Give me more insight into how a customer of a CSP would leverage the network virtualized capabilities that allow us to build out essentially individual computers on a network for a company to play in. It's their own sandbox.
So you could have as your own sandbox there. You're setting up a shop. You're now an application developer. You're creating a new application, and you're tying that into the 5G network, whether to reach a bunch of consumers or particular enterprises. Now, how do you effectively and cost efficiently do that? That's a matter of how many resources you're consuming, how nicely that's linked into the operations, so that once you actually build and deploy this, by building it cloud native and holding to those principles, you can actually automate that for tight linkage into your operations, into your business processes as well.
Paul, because you've helped CSPs build out 5G, Help us understand some of those challenges associated with, again, essentially CSPs becoming cloud providers.
So when you look at the challenges that CSPs are looking at, again, as I mentioned, it's about being able to quickly deploy these kinds of services and capabilities, but doing it within a network infrastructure that's flexible and dynamic enough to be able to support those. And that's where you look at these different end-to-end parts of our solution, whether the network that's down there gets direction from the orchestration that comes from the network slicing piece of it. You have the cloud that's managing all the different pieces of the infrastructure across the different slices or within the overarching network. It's the security aspects of being able to make sure everything's safe. So when you look at the challenges of the operator, you can look at each of these individual end-to-end pieces and see, how do they fit together in an easy way fashion. So I can maybe introduce portions of it and then build on the other pieces as I need to and bring them along. So, deploying 5G isn't just a one-shot kind of activity. It's going to be an evolution. You see it in the standards where we're starting out with what we call the 5G non-standalone solution, which incorporates parts of our LTE core into it, but with the long-term goal of having a totally 5G standalone system that really takes advantages of all the functions that we have there.
So it's not just an evolution of the network, it's also an evolution of the business model.
Oh, absolutely. The business model is going to play a lot more, I think, impact on how the actual services are going to be deployed in there. I think a big part of 5G with the capabilities of providing unique and custom differentiated services where you can put specific applications where they need to be. Say, you look at something like a stadium where you could have, say, a particular service centered around all those kids who are uploading Facebook stuff to share on Twitter or Snapchat. But then you have your local security team who needs a lot of functions very close because they need quick, fast, reactive communication with maybe video monitoring systems that are doing automated intelligence. So each one of these really provides a unique challenge, but from a business perspective, it becomes a service that you can actually go and provide value to the people who are really using them, the humans that are out there, as we talked earlier. So the business capabilities and the network pieces, these are going to become, I think, much more closely coupled together as these communication solutions get deployed.
And these solutions, again, at the end of the day, all come down to making us more human.
Yeah, making us more human and this ability to logically separate this infrastructural investment that the operators are making and then afford capabilities to different customers, businesses, and so forth to their needs. But still, as the operator, I'm responsible for that infrastructure. And I'm the sole owner and manager of that infrastructure at the infrastructural level. Yet I'm giving logical ownership to pieces of the infrastructure to my business partners, and then they are the custodian of it for their business purpose. And the standards provide for a lot of the ways in which those definitions will exist, but there's a lot of business practice changes that have to happen. This is my network, I manage the whole thing, behavior has got to continue at the infrastructural level, but there still has to be a technique of releasing some controls to the business partners who are going to take their own control of their logical partition.
Ed, final thoughts from you.
So cloud decouples growth from the cost to run the network and deploy the network. So growth and cost get separated. It also lets you deliver a lot more services. But the problem is cloud hasn't lived up to its promise. All right? So what's needed is to transition over to cloud native and distributed cloud. Come talk with us. We've been doing this. We can help you plan your transition. And by moving over to cloud native and distributed cloud, it puts you back in control.
Jay?
Enterprises are the way to go for 5G, right? But CSPs still have to do a lot of work in terms of getting them on board. We look at the expectation between what CSPs are thinking and what enterprises are thinking of 5G. There's still a huge gap. So there is education still required from the CSP end to the enterprise side. Plus, they need to tap into the way they're behaving with enterprises. We talk about business models, that has got a critical role. They need to tap into the startup market to get this ecosystem in place before going to the enterprise. That makes it easier for them.
Paul?
Yeah, I think we look at 5G, it's more than just another G. It's really about service providers being able to create new revenue generating opportunities and digitalization of their services that they have. And it's these end-to-end components that Nokia's looked at that really allow service providers to be able to make these capabilities happen within their networks.
Final thoughts from you, sir.
Yeah, I would say let's do this profitably. We speak about the opportunity space. Some GSMA has said some 300 billion is the opportunity. There's many other indices that people use, but let's tap into that opportunity, but do so profitably. We've mentioned that this network is doing anything getting more complex. So there's really interesting capabilities that 5G provides, and it needs to be exposed to the enterprise market so that they can participate. But operators have a lot of work that they can do so that they can get a piece of that revenue stream in a profitable way. And that profitable way is coming through automation.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you.
Bill Stanley is a portfolio manager joining us from New York. Paul Norkus is a 5G marketing manager. Jay Fattle is the global head of marketing from London. Ed Elkin is the marketing lead for E2E Cloud from Chicago. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.